that child long ago. My soul starts to linger. It's home, I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me along to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam. Wherever I go, to that place I know it'll always be home, home to me.
The gentle rolling hills of Uxbridge Township, northeast of Toronto, have been home at one time to 3 of this century's great artists: an author, a painter, and a musician. Not only can this area lay claim to some famous people, but just down the road is the only tomb between Newfoundland and Vancouver Island that was inspired by the Taj Mahal. I'm Harvey Kirk. Join me in this episode of Sketches of Our Town. We'll explore the township of Uxbridge. A crisp autumn morning. Perfect weather for a hot air balloon experience. Below is the township of Uxbridge. 500 square kilometers of farmland, lying midway between Lake Simcoe and Lake Ontario in Durham County. Some of the finest dairy and beef herds in southern Ontario are raised here. A number of small, closely knit hamlets like Goodwood, Roseville, Sandford, and Leaskdale surround the larger center of Uxbridge. The town has been the region's business and social center for over a century. In 1805, Dr. Christopher Beswick from Pennsylvania built the first mill on a creek just east of this present-day library. But it wasn't until 40 years later that Uxbridge began to grow. A Quaker by the name of Joseph Gould was the principal developer. He built grist and woolen mills, a high school, and was the first reeve when the community became a village in 1872. Uxbridge's development was assured with the completion of the Toronto and Nipissing Railroad, the first operating narrow-gauge railway in North America. As a testament to the village's expanding importance, the Toronto Dominion Bank opened a branch here, one of its first outside of Toronto. In earlier times, a trip into Uxbridge from the surrounding countryside was a major event. It was a chance to pick up supplies, catch up on the latest news, or maybe get a haircut.
Now, do you remember Mr. Gould's monument works there?
Oh, yeah.
Far way down the street?
Yeah.
Today, people still come into town for much the same reasons.
Even with only one side down.
That was a really big
It's all
deal,
haircut
wasn't
and
it?
you're getting.
How many,
You don't know how lucky you are. I never cut your ear.
how many people worked at the gold mill?
Oh.
Oh, Alan. How are you, John?
Pretty good, thanks.
Good. It's kind of breezy out today.
It's a little wintry.
Yeah, it's really windy out on Quaker Hill.
I'll bet it is. Got some new stuff for me.
Well, not really, but I went through my pictures and I wasn't able to find another one of your storefront.
I was kind of interested in...
With its proximity to Toronto, the region is gradually being urbanized, but the friendly, rural character of the place has been preserved. The feed mill is a reminder of Uxbridge's beginnings as a milling center and the ongoing importance of agriculture to the town's economy. The pioneering families of the region were Quakers, a religious group founded in England during the 17th century as a protest against the Church of England's formalization of worship. Quakers, also known as the Society of Friends, believe that no priestly go-between is required in order to experience the grace of God. North of the town, on Quaker Hill, is the burial ground and meeting house, signifying their roots in the township. Laura Piers, author and historian, has studied Quaker settlement.
The Quakers in the Uxbridge community mostly came from the vicinity of Catawissa in Pennsylvania. Quakers had emigrated to the United States as soon as they possibly could because they were being persecuted in Britain. And you have to understand that Quakerism, as well as refusing to support war, also refused to support many kinds of authority. And so they refused to use titles of address, such as Sir or My King or Highness or anything like that. They refused to take off their hats in the presence of authorities. And they were regarded with some horror. During the American Revolution, though, Quakers faced a lot of persecution again, either because they refused to fight or because they still had some loyalties to Britain.
The Quakers lost their lands and their goods were seized. They were threatened by mobs and they were imprisoned. Many fled the United States and headed north to Canada, including the dozen or so families who came to Uxbridge. They were plain in dress and speech and were a practical people. They not only met for worship, but once a month, separate business meetings were held for the men and the women.
The building we're in right now is the Uxbridge Quaker Meeting House that was built around 1820 to replace, we think, an older log structure. A typical service for worship would have been conducted almost completely in silence. It wasn't at all like the kinds of religious services that we have today. The people would have come in, sat down, and then said nothing for several hours. If somebody had a particularly revealing inspiration, they would stand up and tell their community about it. But what they were doing was waiting for direct inspiration from God. They were waiting for that inward light, as they called it, of God to shine through. This was the people who had endured all kinds of persecution and harassment and being burned out of their houses and thrown out of countries, and who had ended up here at a time when Uxbridge didn't exist, really, except for a name on the map. I was really fascinated with the women's gatherings once a month and the strength that showed in them by their really eager desire to be literate. They founded schools before anybody else had schools in this area. they were just a very, very strong people, and they managed to survive in this area. And I was not just fascinated, I suppose. There's a real admiration for people who can be uprooted so many times and manage to put down roots so strong in this community.
The Taj Mahal of Durham County, better known as Foster's Memorial, is something you wouldn't expect among the cornfields. Thomas Foster, a colorful former mayor of Toronto, built his tomb for $250,000 at the height of the Depression. His extravagance during such difficult times offended many in the area. They dubbed the structure Foster's Folly. But it can't be said that Foster wasn't generous. He did give to a number of causes. There was money for cancer research, feeding birds, and apprehending poachers. And he also sponsored a contest that gave a prize to the woman who could produce the most babies in 10 years. His interpretation of how to populate the region. "50 years ago, a musical genius made one of his first public appearances in Uxbridge. He played 2 original compositions. He was 5 years old. His name was Glenn Gould. Gould would become one of the world's preeminent pianists, but he would never forget the happy memories of summers spent in the township visiting his grandparents. Another great artist who knew this countryside intimately was a man of unique achievement in Canadian art. Some of his most accomplished works were completed while living here. David Milne's concentrated and highly personal style was little appreciated during his lifetime, while today his work is eagerly sought by art collectors from around the world. Milne, an urbane and sophisticated man, lived most of his life in rural areas, as much for financial reasons as a need for solitude. In 1940, he moved to Uxbridge, where he lived for the next 12 years. Harold and Celia Ledru came to know Milne during those years.
He came out here and saw the hills, the rolling hills and everything, and found a little house that was cheap to live in. And nobody knew him, which is part of his desire anyway. Kept to himself, and of course he rented a studio up over the drugstore that Seal worked in.
When he was going up to Temagami, where he was very much wrapped up with Temagami, where he liked to paint, and he'd come in the drugstore at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we had 2 old stools that had springs on them that would go back. You'd only stay down when you sat on them. And he'd come and he'd sit there and wait until it was time to go up and get the train. And I would be so excited about him coming and staying for that length of time, and sometimes I may get 4 words out of him, sometimes I may get 12. But he would only talk to me when he had something to either ask me or he made a statement. His words, when he would talk to me, were more statements than they were conversations. And but he always wanted to know about the politics of the town, who was going to be mayor. He'd get in little conversations of that. When I asked him about his art, to talk to him about art, he would talk to nobody about it.
But he, a gentleman, you know, very, very quiet. Also, he did not want to be in the center of things. He didn't want to really associate too much with other artists in connection with his work.
David Milne once said, I suppose each painter has his own way of launching into adventures in shape, color, texture, and space that we call painting. I mostly fall into them. In the hamlet of Leesdale lived one of Canada's most beloved writers. Many of us associate her with Prince Edward Island, but for 15 years, the author of Anne of Green Gables, Lucy Maud Montgomery, lived here, in this house. She arrived in 1911, already a famous author, having written Anne 3 years earlier. She had recently married the Reverend Ewan MacDonald, who became the new pastor at the Presbyterian Church in Leesdale.
September 24th, 1911. The manse is quite prettily situated. When we came in the first night and surveyed the place by lantern light, it didn't look very homelike. But I had a mental vision of what it would be when we got it all in order, and I ran over the house like a pleased child. It was our home, and I was its mistress. No woman ever forgets this delightful sensation. My greatest disappointment in connection with it is that it has no bathroom or toilet. I had hoped that I might have a home with these at least. Oh, but what is to be will be. It is Allah. We must submit.
Mrs. Mary Stiver is a lifelong resident of Leesdale. What kind of a person was she? Was she busy? Was she outgoing and friendly? Was she nice to talk to?
Yes, I would say she was. But she was always very busy, and she always, her hands were never still. And once a year, she tried to go with Mr. MacDonald, and they tried to visit the congregation. Mm-hmm. But that was a very boring time to her because she didn't care for that.
These horrible pastoral visits are, I really believe, an invention of the devil himself. 9 out of 10 of the visits are wearisome beyond description, both mentally and physically. I teach a class in Sunday school and do a good deal of work for our Young People's Guild, which meets fortnightly. This I rather like, however. It is more in my line. We have a very good guild, and the young fry take a great deal of interest in it.
Well, I remember one night when we gave her a bouquet of red roses in our Young People's Society. After the meeting, after the program was over, 2 of the girls went forward, and one read a short an address to her, and the other presented her with a dozen red roses. Now, of course, she made a little speech, but before she made the speech, there were a lot of tears rolled down her cheeks, and they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of joy.
Lucy Maud Montgomery would write 11 novels during her stay in Leesdale, an extraordinary accomplishment given her tasks as minister's wife and a mother. She liked this part of the world. She liked
This was the second best place in the world. Prince Edward Island was the best, and then Leesdale.
In 1926, Lucy Maud said goodbye to the parishioners of St. Paul's Presbyterian Church. The MacDonalds were leaving for a new congregation. Was the community pretty sad?
Well, I was, and I think a good many were sad. I think at that time maybe we realized more than ever that she was Lucy Maud Montgomery.
I find it hard to believe that 15 years have passed since that day Ewan and I arrived in Leaskdale. Roots that have been rooted so long as that are not pulled up without pain.
The refuge to which the pioneering families came to put down roots is now home to more than 19,000 people. But the early story has been preserved. In Uxbridge Township, you don't have to look far to be reminded of its unique history: the Quaker Meeting House, Foster's Memorial, Lucy Maud's house. Stephen Leacock, who once taught school here, I think put it best. I never realized, he said, that there was history, too, close at hand, beside my very own home. I did not realize that the old grave that stood among the brambles at the foot of our farm was history. Something to think about. I'm Harvey Kirk.